Over the last couple of weeks, I've been playing through Hogwarts Legacy, the latest in a long list of games that have been adapted from the Harry Potter series. For about as long as there have been video games, there have been titles based upon existing properties. With the occasional refreshing exception, most of these games have been pretty bad. But in more recent years, something seems to be changing. The proverbial bar of quality for licensed games appears to be rising. Hogwarts Legacy is a perfect example, which is now generally agreed to be the best game based in the Harry Potter universe, but it's not alone. Across the board, licensed titles are turning heads and subverting expectations. Why is this? I want to spend a few minutes dissecting a few recent examples of high-quality adaptations and investigate why we seem to have entered a golden age of licensed games. Hogwarts Legacy is, in a word, ambitious. Developed by Avalanche Software, a studio with a long history but little notoriety, the game caught players' eyes with what seemed to be a pretty accurate recreation of Hogwarts Castle and its surrounding land. While some of the existing Harry Potter games dabbled in a more open-world structure, Hogwarts Legacy appeared to jump into that ambition head first. After playing the game for 30 hours, I can confirm that Avalanche made good on its lofty goals. This is, without question, the largest Harry Potter game ever made by a long shot. I wouldn't call myself a big Harry Potter fan, having seen all of the movies but never reading the books, and yet the experience of exploring the eponymous castle in Hogwarts Legacy was truly magical. The first 8 or so hours of the game were some of the most wondrous I've had all year. Hogwarts is clearly crafted with painstaking detail and is filled with a bevy of secret passageways and hidden rooms, exactly what you'd hope for and expect. It makes me realize just how rare it is to see a video game attempt to construct such a massive, explorable structure like this. Huge open worlds can feel like a dime a dozen these days, but the opportunity to traverse such a grand structure is surprisingly unique.
Before the invention of the golden snitch, which magical creature was used in a game of Quidditch?
The Golden Snuggery.
No.
Avalanche chose to set the game many decades before The Boy Who Lived was even born, freeing the studio to craft a narrative untethered by this IP's famous characters. This was a really smart decision, as divorcing Hogwarts Legacy from Harry Potter allowed Avalanche to exhibit a much higher degree of creative freedom. What results is a game that feels like a greatest hits album. From flying brooms to Wingardium Leviosa, pretty much everything you'd expect is on display. Hogwarts Legacy is by no means perfect. The story is forgettable and the greater open world fails to match the quality of Hogwarts Castle, but regardless, the game stands as a worthwhile action RPG, even if you don't know a Gryffindor from a Hufflepuff.
Oh, this really is too much.
Peter Quill. Peter Quill, wake up.
Holy crap, Drax. You gotta stop doing this, man. It's weird.
Speaking of IPs with a bunch of terminology I don't understand, let's talk about Guardians of the Galaxy. You'd have to live under a rock to not at least have heard of the Marvel film series, but its video game sibling is decidedly lesser known. Released in 2021 and developed by Eidos Montreal, Guardians of the Galaxy didn't seem to make much of a splash commercially, but that doesn't mean it's not worth discussing. The game is a third-person action RPG in which you control Star-Lord, the charismatic leader of the ragtag Guardians crew. The gang finds themselves involved in a crisis that could potentially end not just a world, but an entire galaxy. You're the only ones that can stop it, which means you better get ready to fight, with style of course. As I mentioned, the game is an action RPG, but unlike a lot of modern entries in that genre, it's not open world, opting for a more story-driven, linear experience. The importance of narrative here can't be overstated, as the game features a massive script, thankfully filled with some of the best game writing I've heard in the last couple of years. I know a lot of people are fatigued of that snarky Marvel dialogue at this point, myself included, but this is a step above what you'd expect from a video game adaptation.
Die, weird floating thing!
Interestingly, you're only able to control Star-Lord. When the game was first revealed, I assumed you'd be able to select your preferred character, but while you can issue commands to your teammates during combat, you'll never take direct control of anyone other than Peter Quill. After playing the game, I think this is the right call. It allows for a more tailored experience, as Eidos was able to avoid having to develop fleshed out movesets for every single Guardian. Instead, they each have a handful of moves that can be learned over the course of the game and utilized on a cooldown at the player's discretion. It's really clear that Eidos wanted to deliver a quality Guardians experience, and one of the most important ways to do that is to avoid biting off more than you can chew. For my money, the biggest foundational factor that makes Guardians of the Galaxy so good, and a huge part of what makes a great licensed experience, is that Eidos Montreal let the IP guide the game. What do I mean by that? Well, if you had to envision what kind of game a Guardians adaptation would be, assuming you're familiar with the franchise, what would it be? Personally, I'd want what we got, a story-driven action game predicated on telling a compelling story across a bunch of varied planets. Eidos could have gone in so many different directions. A 5v5 hero shooter, a live service game, a minigame collection. I'm not saying those games couldn't have worked, although I have serious doubts about that last one, but what was ultimately made is exactly the kind of game that makes sense for this specific IP. Instead of chasing trends, Eidos smartly crafted an experience that just made sense and ultimately honored the source material.
Throw him.
No!
Very well.
Peter!
It's okay, he'll land on his feet. I guess that only applies to cats.
That brings us to the Batman Arkham series, developed by Rocksteady Studios. From Arkham Asylum to Arkham City to Arkham Knight, the game we're looking at here, Rocksteady has played a hugely important role in the improvement of licensed games. The first game in its Batman trilogy, Arkham Asylum, released all the way back in 2009, a time when most video game adaptations felt doomed to mediocrity. To most everyone's surprise, the game reviewed extremely well, gaining a reputation as one of the best video games released that year. In fact, Arkham Asylum actually held the Guinness World Record for the most critically acclaimed superhero game, until it was surpassed in 2011 by its very own sequel, Batman Arkham City. Through the entire trilogy, Rocksteady continued to up the scale and scope of each title, beginning with a Metroidvania-esque structure, then adding an open world in Arkham City, then incorporating vehicular combat and traversal in Arkham Knight. Despite tweaking and expanding the mechanics of each game, Rocksteady always ensured consistent quality and prioritized the degree to which the series embodied Batman. I really don't know that much about The Dark Knight, but man, I sure felt like Batman when I played. This immersion is felt both stylistically and mechanically, as you're granted full access to Batman's various gadgets as you glide around a densely populated, nocturnal urban landscape. Rocksteady may be on shaky ground lately with the much less successful licensed title Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League, but it can't be overstated just how much the developer paved the way for quality video game adaptations.
I swear that's all I know.
If you're lying, I'll break the other one.
The other one. Ah!
Now, of course, the quality of a licensed game these days is far from guaranteed. There were those terrible games based on King Kong and The Walking Dead that were released last year, and plenty of other duds that don't receive as much media attention. Underwhelming or even flat-out bad games will always be released, but the titles I've discussed here in this video are just a few examples of how much the licensed tide has begun to turn. The important question to ask is, why is this? Well, you could argue that the baseline quality for studio games is rising in general, which I think is true and does play a role, but ultimately, I'd argue that the biggest reason that video game adaptations are getting so much better is an increased legitimacy of the medium. 40, 30, or even 20 years ago, video games were viewed by many as a juvenile distraction. By virtue of that unfortunate fact, a video game based on a new movie, for example, was viewed simply as an easy way to cash in. A development studio would then be given an extremely short time frame to create some kind of video game approximation of the film. Delays weren't an option, as the game had no choice but to launch alongside the movie's theatrical release. Unsurprisingly, this led to rushed, low-quality video games. More recently, however, things have begun to change. What's one thing that all three of the games I've covered here have in common? None of them were made to coincide with anything else. Yes, all of these games were crafted upon established intellectual properties, but they weren't forced to hit an arbitrary deadline to support a movie or television series. They were allowed to stand on their own 2 feet and just exist as video games. We're continuing to see increased popularity and relevancy of this medium, leading not just to improved games, but also better adaptations based on video games. TV shows like The Last of Us and Fallout demonstrate how valuable the well of gaming is. Now, I don't need this type of validation to see how great video games are. I've known that since I was a kid. But still, the more attention the medium garners, the more high-quality games we're going to get. I mean, we've got Indiana Jones and the Great Circle and Star Wars Outlaws on the way before the end of 2024. I know it's easy to maintain an eye of skepticism, but I really think it's time to open up our minds to the possibilities. I mean, I'm really not even a fan of Harry Potter, or Guardians of the Galaxy, or Batman, but I didn't need to be in order to enjoy these experiences. They're just great video games, and that's good enough for me.